The sovereign citizen movement is a loose grouping of American, Canadian and Australian litigants, commentators, tax protesters, and financial scheme promoters. Self-described sovereign citizens see themselves as answerable only to their particular interpretation of the common law and as not subject to any government statutes or proceedings. In the United States they do not recognize United States currency and maintain that they are free of any legal constraints. They especially reject most forms of taxation as illegitimate. Participants in the movement argue this concept in opposition to the idea of federal citizens, who, they say, have unknowingly forfeited their rights by accepting some aspect of federal law. The doctrines of the movement resemble those of the freemen on the land movement more commonly found in the Commonwealth, such as in Britain and in Canada. Many members of the sovereign citizen movement believe that the United States government is illegitimate. J.J. McNabb, who writes for Forbes about anti-government extremism, has described the sovereign citizen movement as consisting of individuals who believe that the county sheriff is the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country, with authority superior to that of any federal agent, elected official, or local law enforcement official. This belief comes from the movement's origins in the white extremist group Posse Comitatus. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, classifies some sovereign citizens, sovereign citizen extremists, as domestic terrorists. In 2010 the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, estimated that approximately 100,000 Americans were hardcore sovereign believers, with another 200,000 just starting out by testing sovereign techniques for resisting everything from speeding tickets to drug charges. In surveys conducted in 2014 and 2015, representatives of U.S. law enforcement ranked the risk of terrorism from the sovereign citizen movement higher than the risk from Islamic extremism. The New South Wales Police Force in Australia has also identified sovereign citizens as a potential terrorist threat. Theories. Writing in American Scientific Affiliation, Dennis L. Foyt reviewed American Militias, Rebellion, Racism and Religion by Richard A. Baines, and described the theory of Richard MacDonald, a sovereign citizen leader, which is that there are two classes of citizens in America: the original citizens of the states, or states citizens, and U.S. citizens. MacDonald asserts that U.S. citizens or 14th Amendment citizens have civil rights, legislated to give the freed black slaves after the Civil War rights comparable to the unalienable constitutional rights of white state citizens. The benefits of U.S. citizenship are received by consent in exchange for freedom. State citizens consequently take steps to revoke and rescind their U.S. citizenship and reassert their de jure common law state citizen status. This involves removing oneself from federal jurisdiction and relinquishing any evidence of consent to U.S. citizenship, such as a social security number, driver's license, car registration, use of zip codes, marriage license, voter registration, and birth certificate. Also included is refusal to pay state and federal income taxes because citizens not under U.S. jurisdiction are not required to pay them. Only resident aliens, of the states, not its citizens, are income taxable, state citizens argue. And as a state citizen landowner, one can bring forward the original land patent and file it with the county for absolute or allodial property rights. Such allodial ownership is held without recognizing any superior to whom any duty is due on account thereof. Black's Law Dictionary. Superiors include those who levy property taxes or who hold mortgages or liens against the property. In support of his theories, MacDonald has established state citizen service centers around the United States as well as a related web presence. Writer Richard A. Baines asserts that sovereign citizens fail to sufficiently examine the context of the case laws they cite, and ignore adverse evidence, such as Federalist No. 15, where Alexander Hamilton expressed the view that the Constitution placed everyone personally under federal authority. Some sovereign citizens also claim that they can become immune to most or all laws of the United States by renouncing their citizenship, a process they refer to as expatriation, which involves filing or delivering a bogus, non-legal document claiming to renounce citizenship in a federal corporation and declaring only to be a citizen of the state in which they reside, to any county clerk's office that can be convinced to accept it. History. The concept of a sovereign citizen originated in the Posse Comitatus movement as a teaching of Christian identity minister William P. Gale. The concept has influenced the tax protester movement, the Christian Patriot movement, and the redemption movement, the last of which claims that the U.S. government uses its citizens as collateral against foreign debt. Gale identified the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution as the act that converted sovereign citizens into federal citizens by their agreement to a contract to accept benefits from the federal government. Other commentators have identified other acts, including the Uniform Commercial Code, the Emergency Banking Act, the Zone Improvement Plan, and the alleged suppression of the Titles of Nobility Amendment. Some of those in the movement believe that the term sovereign citizen is an oxymoron and prefer to label themselves as individuals seeking the truth. Legal status of theories. Variations of the argument that an individual is not subject to various laws because the individual is sovereign have been rejected by the courts, especially in tax cases such as Johnson v. Commissioner. Phyllis Johnson's argument that she was not subject to the federal income tax because she was an individual sovereign citizen was rejected by the court. Wyckoff v. Commissioner, argument by Austin Wyckoff that he was not subject to the federal income tax because he was an individual sovereign citizen was rejected by the court. United States v. Hart, Douglas Hart's argument in response to a lawsuit against him for filing false lien notices against Internal Revenue Service personnel, that the U.S. District Court had no jurisdiction over him because he was a sovereign citizen was rejected by the District Court and the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. Young v. Internal Revenue Service, Jerry Young's argument that the Internal Revenue Code did not pertain to him because he was a sovereign citizen was rejected by the U.S. District Court, and Steckland v. Commissioner, Kenneth Steckland's argument that he was a freeborn and sovereign person and was therefore not subject to the income tax laws was rejected by the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. The court imposed a $3,000 penalty on Steckland for filing a frivolous appeal. In Risner v. Commissioner, Greg Risner's argument that he was not subject to federal income tax because he was a self-governing freeborn sovereign citizen was rejected by the court as being a frivolous protest of the tax laws. See also Maxwell v. Snow, Lawrence Maxwell's arguments that he was not subject to U.S. federal law because he was a sovereign citizen of the Union State of Texas, that the United States was not a republican form of government and therefore must be abolished as unconstitutional, that the Secretary of the Treasury's jurisdiction was limited to the District of Columbia, and that he was not a citizen of the United States were rejected by the court as being frivolous, and Roe v. Internal Revenue Service, Heather Roe's argument that she was not subject to federal income tax because she was not a party to any social compact or contract, because the IRS had no jurisdiction over her or her property, because she was not found within the territorial limited jurisdiction of the U.S., because she was a sovereign citizen of the state of Maine, and because she was not a U.S. citizen as described in 26 U.S.C. 865, g. 1, a, was rejected by the court and was ruled to be frivolous. Other tax cases include Heitman v. Idaho State Tax Commission, Coben v. Commissioner, John Coben's arguments that he had the ability to opt out of liability for federal income tax because he was white, that he was a sovereign citizen of Oregon, that he was a non-resident alien of the United States, and that his sovereign status made his body real property were rejected by the court and were ruled to be frivolous tax protester-type arguments. Glavin v. United States, John Glavin's argument that he was not subject to an Internal Revenue Service summons because, as a sovereign citizen, he was not a citizen of the United States was rejected by the court, and United States v. Greenstreet, Gale Greenstreet's arguments that he was of freeman character and of the white preamble citizenship and not one of the 14th Amendment legislated enfranchised de facto colored races, that he was a white preamble natural sovereign common law de jure citizen of the Republic/State of Texas, and that he was a sovereign, not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States District Court were ruled to be entirely frivolous. In view of such cases, the Internal Revenue Service has added freeborn or sovereign citizenship to its list of frivolous claims that may result in a $5,000 penalty when used as the basis for an inaccurate tax return. Similarly, in a case in which an individual named Andrew Schneider was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison for making a threat by mail, Schneider argued that he was a free, sovereign citizen and therefore was not subject to the jurisdiction of the federal courts. That argument was rejected by the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit as having no conceivable validity in American law. In a criminal case in 2013, the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington noted, "Defendant is apparently a member of a group loosely styled sovereign citizens." The court has deduced this from a number of defendants' peculiar habits. First, like Mr. Leeming, sovereign citizens are fascinated by capitalization. They appear to believe that capitalizing names has some sort of legal effect. For example, defendant writes that the registered facts appearing in the above paragraph evidence the uncontroverted and uncontrovertible facts that the slavery systems operated in the names United States, United States, United States of America, and United States of America, are terminated nunc pro tunc by public policy, UCC 1-103. DEFS mandatory jud. Not. At 2. He appears to believe that by capitalizing United States, he is referring to a different entity than the federal government. For better or for worse, it's the same country. Second, sovereign citizens, like Mr. Leeming, love grandiose legalese. Comes now, Kenneth Wayne, born free to the family Leeming, constituent to the people of the state of Washington constituted 1878 and admitted to the Union February 22, 1889 by Act of Congress, a man, state of body competent to be a witness and having first-hand knowledge of the facts. DEFS mandatory jud. Not. At 1. Third, defendant evinces, like all sovereign citizens, a belief that the federal government is not real and that he does not have to follow the law. Thus, defendant argues that as a result of the registered facts, the states of body, persons, actors, and other parties perpetuating the above-captioned transaction, are engaged in acts of treason, and if unknowingly as victims of treason and fraud. DEFS mandatory jud. Not. At 2. The court therefore feels some measure of responsibility to inform defendant that all the fancy legal-sounding things he has read on the internet are make-believe. Defendant Kenneth Wayne Leeming was found guilty of 3 counts of retaliating against a federal judge or law enforcement officer by a false claim, 1 count of concealing a person from arrest, and 1 count of being a felon in possession of a firearm. On May 24, 2013, Leeming was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. In Australia there have been a few minor cases where parties have invoked arguments surrounding the sovereign man. All of these arguments have failed before Australian courts. The courts in New Zealand also appear to have rejected the sovereign man arguments. Filing of false lien notices. According to the New York Times, cases involving so-called sovereign citizens pose a challenge to law enforcement officers and court officials in connection with the filing of false notices of liens, a tactic sometimes called paper terrorism. Anyone can file a notice of lien against property such as real estate, vehicles, or other assets of another under the Uniform Commercial Code and other laws. In most states of the United States, the validity of liens is not investigated or inquired into at the time of filing. Notices of liens, whether legally valid or not, are a cloud on the title of the property and may affect the property owner's credit rating, ability to obtain home equity loans, refinance the property or take other action with regards to the property. Notices of releases of liens generally must be filed before property may be transferred. The validity of a lien is determined by further legal procedures. Clearing up fraudulent notices of liens may be expensive and time-consuming. Filing fraudulent notices of liens or documents is both a crime and a civil offense, a tort. Incidents: Oklahoma City bombing conspirator Terry Nichols, who was convicted in 2004, was a member of the sovereign citizen movement, having asserted individual sovereignty in at least 3 court cases. 2010. In May 2010, 2 police officers in West Memphis, Arkansas, were shot and killed by Joseph T. Kane after Kane and his father were the subject of a traffic stop. Kane and his father were later identified as members of the sovereign citizen movement. In September 2010, David Russell Merland, an associate of a sovereign citizens group, sent emails and placed telephone calls to various officials of the city of Kirkland, Washington, telling them to keep their doors unlocked, that they were going to be arrested, and that they should not resist. Merland also reportedly threatened federal judges and the chief prosecutor of King County, Washington. Merland's threat to arrest the mayor of Kirkland came about after he was arrested by police. His vehicle had been impounded after he was found driving with a suspended license and expired vehicle license tabs. An unloaded gun with ammunition nearby had been found on the seat of the car. Although he was not a law enforcement officer, Merland had claimed that he had the authority to form a group of private citizens to arrest felons in public office as permitted by RCW 9A.16.020, the state statute governing lawful use of force. On December 2, 2011, Merland was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in federal prison after pleading guilty in connection with the threats he made, including the threat to forcibly arrest the mayor of Kirkland, Washington. Merland was released from prison on January 29, 2014. 2011. In March 2011, a central figure in the sovereign citizen movement named Samuel Lynn Davis pleaded guilty to 31 counts of money laundering in federal district court in Nevada. Davis was snared in a sting operation after he agreed to launder more than $1.29 million in what he believed to be illicit funds. Davis accepted $73,782 in fees to launder the money, not realizing he was dealing with federal law enforcement agents. In October 2011, Davis was sentenced to 4 years and 9 months in federal prison, and was ordered to pay over $95,000 in restitution. As of late July 2012, Davis was classified as a fugitive, having failed to surrender to authorities to begin his prison sentence in June 2012. On August 7, 2012, Davis was arrested by sheriff's deputies in White Earth, North Dakota, and was scheduled for release from prison on April 24, 2017. On November 4, 2011, a federal jury in Montgomery, Alabama, found Monty Irvin guilty of conspiracy to defraud the United States and tax evasion. His wife Patricia Irvin was also found guilty of various related charges. According to a news release by the U.S. Department of Justice, Irvin and his wife had acquired hundreds of investment properties over a 10-year period, had received more than $9 million in rental income, but had paid nothing in federal income taxes. The Irvins reportedly claimed that they were not United States citizens, that they were sovereigns, and that they did not consider themselves subject to federal or state law. Irvin and his wife had also filed documents in probate court attempting to renounce their U.S. citizenship. In one filing, Irvin declared himself to be the governor of Alabama in its original jurisdiction. On May 29, 2012, Monty Irvin was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and Patricia Irvin was sentenced to 5 years of probation, with the condition that she spend 40 consecutive weekends in jail. In December 2011, Sean Talbot Rice was arrested at his home at Seligman, Arizona, after a 10-hour standoff with FBI agents and other law enforcement personnel. On July 24, 2012, Rice was found guilty in federal court in Nevada in connection with the same money laundering scheme that resulted in the conviction of Samuel Lynn Davis. The guilty verdicts came on 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering, 13 counts of money laundering, and 4 counts of failure to appear in court in connection with time that Rice spent as a fugitive. Rice, who had also falsely claimed to be a lawyer and a rabbi, was described as a leader in the anti-government sovereign citizens movement. During the trial, Rice tried to argue that the presiding federal judge had no authority to render a judgment against Rice. On March 20, 2013, Rice was sentenced to 8 years and 2 months in prison, and was ordered to forfeit over $1.29 million. As of early June 2014, Rice is incarcerated at the Florence Federal Correctional Institution at Florence, Colorado, and is scheduled for release on October 9, 2020. 2012. On February 1, 2012, Timothy Garrison, an accountant from Mount Vernon, Washington, was sentenced to 3.5 years in federal prison after having pleaded guilty to tax fraud. He admitted to having filed about 50 falsified tax returns. Federal prosecutors contended that Garrison's actions cost the Internal Revenue Service over $2.4 million in tax revenues. Prosecutors also stated that the 60-year-old accountant had described himself as a sovereign citizen beyond the reach of state and federal law. Garrison had previously served time in federal prison in the 1980s in connection with fraud against investors in a cattle ranch. Garrison was released from federal prison on July 16, 2014. On June 18, 2012, Francis August Schaffer Cox, who had asserted that he was a sovereign citizen, was found guilty in the United States District Court in Anchorage, Alaska, of several felony charges including conspiracy to commit murder. On January 8, 2013, Cox was sentenced to 25 years and 10 months in prison. On June 20, 2012, Anson Chi was arrested by federal authorities for allegedly trying to blow up a natural gas pipeline in a residential area of Plano, Texas. On June 3, 2013, Chi pleaded guilty to a charge of attempting to destroy a natural gas pipeline used in interstate commerce, and to a charge of possessing an explosive device not registered with the National Firearms Registration and Transfer Record. However, on February 26, 2014, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas issued an order granting Chi's motion to withdraw his guilty plea. Eventually, he again pleaded guilty and, on June 11, 2015, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for possession of an unregistered firearm and for malicious use of an explosive. On July 19, 2012, Martin Johnson, who had described himself as a sovereign citizen, was found guilty by a jury in an Indiana federal court of kidnapping his 21-year-old daughter, whom he allegedly had sexually abused, and of obstruction of justice. During the incident, the daughter escaped from a hotel room where Johnson had been holding her, ran naked into a store and begged for help. Johnson was caught on surveillance footage chasing her, dragging her out of the store and pushing her into his car. The daughter reportedly had never been to school and only read books about religion, history, and the government approved by her father. She had seen a doctor only once in her life. On February 19, 2013, Jonasson was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. Jonasson is incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary at Tucson, Arizona, and is scheduled for release on August 10, 2047. On August 16, 2012, 2 sheriff's deputies were shot to death and 2 others seriously wounded after having been ambushed near LaPlace, Louisiana. Authorities arrested 7 suspects, 2 of whom have been identified by law enforcement as members of a sovereign citizens group. On August 27, 2012, Lonnie G. Vernon and Karen Vernon, an Alaska couple who were described as followers of Chauffeur Cox, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder of U.S. District Judge Ralph Beistein, who presided over a federal income tax case based on sovereign citizen theories which had cost the Vernons their house. They also admitted that they had planned to kill Beistein's daughter and grandchildren, and an Internal Revenue Service official. The Vernons bought a silencer-equipped pistol and hand grenades in March 2011, but the seller to whom they disclosed their plans was a confidential informant, and the Vernons were arrested as soon as the transaction had been consummated. At the sentencing hearing on January 7, 2013, Lonnie Vernon continued to assert that he was denying the authority of the court, the judge, and the prosecutors. Karen Vernon was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Lonnie Vernon was sentenced to over 25 years in prison. Lonnie Vernon is incarcerated at a federal prison facility at Terre Haute, Indiana, and is scheduled for release on October 26, 2033. Karen Vernon is incarcerated at a federal prison facility at Waseca, Minnesota, and is scheduled for release on September 4, 2021. On September 10, 2012, David B. Graham of Gwinnett County, Georgia, pleaded guilty to violation of the Georgia racketeering statute. After losing his home in a foreclosure, he moved back into the home and filed a fraudulent quitclaim deed in the county property records in an attempt to transfer the ownership of the home back to himself. He was one of approximately a dozen so-called sovereign citizens who had been indicted on racketeering charges for essentially stealing 18 high-end homes in 8 counties. At the hearing, Graham's attorney disclosed to the court that Graham had been influenced by the sovereign citizen group individuals who believe that they each make up their own sovereign state or nationality, and are thus immune to federal, state and local laws. On September 18, 2012, James Timothy, Tim, Turner was arrested after having been indicted by a federal grand jury in Alabama on 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the United States under 18 U.S.C. 371 by, among other things, allegedly filing a false $300 million bond in an attempt to pay taxes, 1 count of passing a false $300 million bond, 5 additional counts of violations of Section 514, A.2, of Title 18 of the U.S.C., relating to fictitious documents, 1 count of filing false Form 1096 reports with the Internal Revenue Service, 1 count of willful failure to file a federal income tax return, and 1 count of giving false testimony in a federal bankruptcy proceeding. Turner had described himself as the president of a sovereign citizens group called the Republic for the United States of America. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, Turner had also been involved with the Guardians of the Free Republics organization. On March 22, 2013, Turner was found guilty on all charges. On July 31, 2013, he was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. He is incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary, Marion, Illinois, and is scheduled for release in May 2028. On September 27, 2012, 71-year-old Philip Monroe Ballard, who at the time was being held in federal custody in Fort Worth, Texas, facing a trial on federal tax charges scheduled to begin on October 1, 2012, was charged with offering $100,000 in a plot to kill U.S. District Judge John McBride, the judge who was scheduled to preside over the trial. Federal authorities alleged that Ballard gave a fellow inmate detailed instructions to kill Judge McBride with a high-powered rifle from a building across the street from the federal courthouse. Ballard allegedly said the killer could shoot the judge as he entered the courthouse. The Federal Bureau of Investigation also alleged that Ballard had a backup plan to have his accomplice plant a bomb in the judge's vehicle. Ballard's tax trial did not begin on Monday, October 1. Instead, Ballard appeared for a preliminary hearing on the murder solicitation charge on that day. The investigation reportedly had begun a few weeks earlier, following a tip from a fellow inmate. Ballard, who claimed to be a sovereign citizen immune from all U.S. laws, was convicted in 1987 of a federal tax charge in connection with his seizure by force of a Mercedes automobile that was subject to a federal tax lien. In 2011, Ballard was also charged with falsely holding himself out as an attorney. On December 11, 2013, Ballard was found guilty of attempting to hire a hitman to kill the federal judge. On March 17, 2014, Ballard was sentenced to the maximum 20 years in prison for the solicitation to commit murder conviction under 18 U.S.C. 373. Ballard had been awaiting trial on one count of corrupt interference with the U.S. Internal Revenue laws under 26 U.S.C. 7212 and 6 counts of aiding and assisting in preparation of false and fraudulent U.S. federal income tax returns under 26 U.S.C. 7206. Those charges were dropped, however, after Ballard's sentencing in the murder solicitation case. Ballard is scheduled for release in December 2029. On December 11, 2012, Jennifer Herring of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, allegedly led officers on a chase of up to 70 miles per hour while she was talking by cell phone to a 911 dispatcher as she allegedly refused to stop for the police who were trying to apprehend her. According to a news release from the Brunswick County Sheriff's Office, Herring told 911 dispatchers she would pull over for deputies for $300,000. A law enforcement official indicated that Herring was a member of the sovereign citizen movement. Herring eventually was stopped, and was charged with driving while intoxicated, felony flight to elude arrest, driving with a revoked driver license, reckless driving, and driving left of center. Herring also faces a separate charge for failure to appear in court in another case involving a charge of driving while intoxicated. On January 28, 2013, she was indicted by a grand jury. On December 29, 2012, dentist Glenn Richard Unger, alias Dr. Sam Kennedy, was arrested in Ogdensburg, New York, after having been indicted by a federal grand jury 10 days earlier, on one count of attempting to interfere with the administration of the Internal Revenue laws under Internal Revenue Code Section 7212, a. 4 counts of filing false claims for tax refunds under 18 U.S.C. Section 287, 1 count of tax evasion under Internal Revenue Code Section 7201, and 1 count of uttering a fictitious obligation under 18 U.S.C. Section 514, a. 2. He was charged with filing more than $36 million in fraudulent federal income tax refund claims. On January 2, 2013, a federal prosecutor asserted in a court hearing for Unger that Unger was a danger to the community and that Unger had stated that he would rather die than become subject to the government. Unger has been identified as a leader of the sovereign citizen movement. The indictment alleged, among other things, that in June 2011 Unger submitted false documents with the clerk's office of Saratoga County, New York, in an attempt to release a $116,410.43 federal tax lien against him, for taxes and penalties for years 2004, 2005, and 2006. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began looking at Unger in the spring of 2010, in connection with the now-defunct group called the Guardians of the Free Republics, when the FBI was investigating letters that had been sent by that group to the governors of all 50 states, demanding that all governors resign within 3 days. Prosecutors also alleged that Unger filed no valid federal income tax returns between 1999 and 2005. On May 23, 2013, the court ordered a mental competency hearing for Unger after he referred to himself as being deceased. On August 7, 2013, the court ruled that Unger was competent to stand trial. After a 4-day trial, Unger was found guilty of all charges by a jury in federal court in Albany, New York, on October 21, 2013. Evidence in the case also indicated that Unger left his dental business in 2006, and referred about 80 of his patients to an orthodontist, William O'Donnell, without telling O'Donnell that the patients had already prepaid Unger for dental work. After O'Donnell complained to Unger that Th.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.